On the morning of January 24th, 1978, something fell out of the sky over northern Canada. It did not fall gently. It came in at roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour, a streak of fire crossing the pre-dawn darkness above the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, visible from the ground for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. People who were awake at that hour and happened to be outside described it as brighter than the moon, a ball of light that moved too fast and too deliberately, that broke apart as it traveled, shedding pieces of itself across a corridor of wilderness so vast and so remote that most Canadians had never set foot within 500 kilometers of it. The Canadian government knew it was coming. They had been tracking it for weeks, and they had not said a word to the public. What fell that morning was a Soviet satellite called Cosmos 95P4. It was approximately 4 meters long and weighed roughly 4,000 kilograms at launch, though by the time it hit the atmosphere, it had shed much of its outer structure. It had been in orbit since September of 1977, circling the Earth in a surveillance role, monitoring ocean surfaces for the movement of naval vessels. To do its job, it carried on board a nuclear reactor fueled by approximately 30 kilograms of highly enriched uranium-235. Not the kind of uranium you find in a power plant, the kind you find in a weapon. When the satellite began losing altitude in late December 1977 and early January 1978, both the Soviet Union and the United States government knew what was happening. Canadian officials were informed through back channels, and then for reasons that would take years to fully understand, a decision was made at the highest levels of government on both sides of the border about how much the Canadian public would be allowed to know. What followed was one of the largest classified recovery operations in North American history. It involved hundreds of military personnel, specialized radiation detection, equipment flown in from the United States, unmarked aircraft operating over Canadian territory, indigenous communities that were not warned and not consulted, and a debris field stretching across more than 124,000 square kilometers of subarctic wilderness that took years to partially survey and has never been fully mapped to this day. The official story, when the Canadian government finally acknowledged what had happened, was careful and measured and incomplete. There was a satellite. It carried a reactor. Most of it burned up on re-entry. The pieces that landed were recovered. There was no significant danger to the public. You can go about your lives. But the documents that have since been declassified, slowly and in fragments, across decades of access to information requests and cross-border archival research, tell a story that is considerably more complicated than that. They describe pieces of radioactive debris that were never found. They describe contamination levels in certain areas that exceeded what was publicly disclosed. They describe indigenous communities whose water sources and hunting grounds were directly affected, who received no warning and no compensation. They describe a diplomatic negotiation with the Soviet Union conducted entirely in secret while the cleanup was still underway, a negotiation whose full terms have still not been made public. And they describe something else, something found in the snow of the Northwest Territories in the weeks following the crash, something that the teams on the ground were ordered not to discuss, something that appears in early internal reports and then disappears from every subsequent document as if it had been cut out of the record with a very careful hand. This is the story of what happened in the Canadian Arctic in 1978. It is a story about the Cold War and about sovereignty and about the price of secrecy. But it is also a story about what governments decide their citizens cannot handle knowing, and what happens when that information begins, slowly and imperfectly, to come back to the surface. If you have been following events like this for any length of time, you already know that the official version of a classified incident is never the complete version. You know that the documents released first are never the most important documents, and you know that the communities closest to these events, the people who actually lived in the affected areas, the search teams who worked the ground, the scientists who analyzed the samples, often carry with them a version of events that never made it into any government report. This is their story too. If you want to stay updated as more declassified material surfaces on stories like this one, subscribe and hit the notification bell. New material on this case continues to emerge, and when it does, you will want to be here for it. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. People are coming to this story from all over, and I want to know who is paying attention. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in January 1978, you have to understand what Canada's Arctic was in the years leading up to it, what it meant strategically, what was happening in the skies above it, and why the government of Pierre Trudeau found itself in a position where it had no good options and chose, as governments so often do, the option that protected its own interests first. Canada in the mid-1970s was a country wrestling with its own sense of itself. The October crisis of 1970, when Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act and suspended civil liberties in response to FLQ terrorism in Quebec, had left a complicated legacy. The country had survived, but the trust between citizens and federal institutions had been strained in ways that did not simply heal. At the same time, Canada was navigating an awkward position in the Cold War. It was a NATO ally, it shared a continent with the United States, and was, by any practical measure, deeply integrated into American military and intelligence infrastructure. But it also maintained a tradition of peacekeeping, of presenting itself as a middle power rather than a belligerent one, of finding space between the superpowers where a country of its size and temperament could operate. The Arctic was where that tension was most acute. Canada claimed sovereignty over roughly 10 million square kilometers of Arctic territory, including the Northwest Passage, the channel of water running through the Arctic archipelago that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The United States did not formally recognize Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, treating it instead as an international strait. This was not a new dispute. It had been simmering since at least 1969, when an American oil tanker called the Manhattan and transited the passage without asking Canadian permission, and Canada had been forced to watch, furious and largely powerless, as the Americans demonstrated that they could move through Canadian waters whenever they felt like it. By 1978, Canada had enacted the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act and was pushing hard in international forums for recognition of its Arctic claims. Trudeau's government understood that sovereignty, to mean anything, had to be exercised. You cannot claim territory you cannot monitor, cannot govern, cannot protect. And monitoring the Canadian Arctic in 1978 meant, among other things, being aware of what was happening in the skies above it, what was passing through the airspace, what might fall from that airspace onto Canadian soil. The distant early warning line, the chain of radar stations stretching from Alaska across northern Canada to Greenland, had been operational since the late 1950s. It was a joint American-Canadian system designed to detect Soviet bombers and missiles approaching North America over the polar route. By the 1970s, the DEW line was already beginning to feel its age. The threat had shifted from bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles, which came in faster than any radar warning system could do. Much about anyway, but the infrastructure was still there, the radar dome still turning in the Arctic cold, the personnel still rotating through stations in places with names that most southern Canadians had never heard. It was through this surveillance architecture, partly, that Canadian officials became aware of what was happening to Cosmos 984. But the awareness was imperfect, and the channels through which information traveled were complicated by the nature of the relationship between Canada and the United States when it came to Arctic intelligence. The Americans knew more. They always knew more. And what they shared with Canada, and when they shared it, was a choice they made based on their own interests, not Canada's. Cosmos 954 had been launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome in what is now Kazakhstan on September 18th, 1977. It was part of the Soviet Rorsat program, which stood for Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite. The purpose of these satellites was exactly what the name suggests. They orbited at relatively low altitudes, somewhere between 250 and 280 kilometers above the Earth's surface, using active radar to track surface ships. The low altitude gave them better resolution, better ability to distinguish individual vessels, better data on fleet movements and naval positioning. But it also meant they burned through fuel quickly and had short operational lifespans. The power source was the problem that drove the design toward nuclear. At those altitudes, solar panels large enough to power active radar would create too much drag. A nuclear reactor, compact and extremely energy dense, could power the radar systems for months without any of those aerodynamic complications. The Soviet Union had been flying Rorsat satellites since the early 1970s. They knew the risks. They had contingency plans, or said they did, for controlled deorbit over open ocean. But satellites do not always do what they are designed to do. By late December 1977, American tracking stations monitoring Cosmos 954 began detecting anomalies in its orbital parameters. The satellite was losing altitude faster than expected. The normal operational profile involved periodic engine firings to maintain orbit, and those firings were not happening. Something was wrong with the propulsion system. The satellite was going to come down, and it was going to come down uncontrolled, which meant nobody could reliably predict where it would land. The debris footprint could stretch across thousands of kilometers of whatever part of the Earth happened to be below the re-entry track at the moment it broke up. American officials notified Soviet counterparts through diplomatic channels in early January 1978. The Soviets were aware of the problem. What the Americans asked for, and what the Soviets declined to provide in any meaningful way, was technical information about the reactor design. Information that would help recovery teams understand what exactly they might be dealing with if pieces landed somewhere they needed to be retrieved. The Soviets acknowledged there was a reactor aboard. They did not specify its design, its fuel load, the form in which the uranium was contained, or what precautions might be necessary when handling it. That information was classified. It would remain classified for years. The Canadians were informed on January 18, 1978, 6 days before the satellite came down. 6 days. The debris field, once the re-entry track became clear, was projected to cross Canadian territory. The government of Pierre Trudeau was told that a Soviet nuclear-powered satellite was likely going to scatter radioactive debris across northern Canada, that the exact composition and condition of the nuclear material could not be verified because the Soviets were not sharing that information, and that the United States was prepared to assist with recovery operations, but that all of this would need to be handled with considerable discretion. What was not discussed in those 6 days, at least not in any document that has since been released, was whether to tell Canadians. The decision not to issue a public warning was made at the level of cabinet, or just below it, in consultation with American officials, and it was based on several considerations that the government found convincing at the time. First, the re-entry track projected that the satellite would break up before it reached populated areas. The debris, if it landed in Canada at all, would land in the Northwest Territories, in the subarctic Barrens, north of Yellowknife and west of Baker Lake, in some of the most sparsely populated real estate on the planet. A public announcement would cause panic without providing any practical benefit to the people most at risk, because the people most at risk were largely not connected to broadcast media and would not receive the warning anyway. That logic was not wrong exactly. It was just incomplete in ways that would take years to fully appreciate. The satellite entered the atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean west of the Queen Charlotte Islands at approximately 6:53 in the morning, local time, on January 24th, 1978. It was traveling northwest to southeast relative to the Earth's surface, and it was coming apart as it fell. Atmospheric friction does not destroy a satellite cleanly. It breaks it into pieces, and those pieces, depending on their mass and aerodynamic properties, follow different trajectories. Some burn completely, some do not. The reactor core, specifically designed to withstand re-entry in the event of an accident, did not burn. It was intended to be robust enough to survive intact, or to fragment in ways that kept radioactive material from dispersing widely into the upper atmosphere. In practice, what happened was more complicated. The core did fragment, but not cleanly. The uranium fuel, encased in metal, scattered across the re-entry track in pieces ranging from dust-sized particles to chunks several centimeters across. The area of the debris field on the ground, once the search teams began mapping it, extended from just south of the Yukon Northwest Territory's border, eastward across the Barrens toward the west shore of Baker Lake, a corridor roughly 800 kilometers long and varying in width from a few kilometers to several dozen. The first pieces were found within hours of the re-entry, not by search teams, but by accident. A party of indigenous hunters from the community of Lutzel Cay, then still known by its colonial name Snowdrift, was traveling by snowmobile east of their community when they encountered a section of the satellite's outer structure, a curved piece of metal roughly 1.5 meters across, lying in the snow. They had no way of knowing what it was. They examined it, touched it, loaded it onto a sled to bring back to the community because salvageable metal of any kind was useful, and continued toward their hunting ground. They were not warned until days later, after search teams had reached the area and begun assessing contamination levels. The level of radioactive contamination in and around the piece they had found was significant. What happened to the hunters who touched it? What medical assessments were conducted? What follow-up care, if any, was provided? Is a question that has been asked repeatedly over the subsequent decades and has received only incomplete and unsatisfying answers from the Canadian government. Operation Morning Light was the name given to the joint Canadian-American search and recovery operation. It was organized with remarkable speed, considering the logistical challenges involved. Within 48 hours of the re-entry, teams were being assembled at Namao Air Force Base near Edmonton, Alberta. American military aircraft from the United States Air Force, operating under a bilateral agreement that was not publicly disclosed, were already in the air over northern Canada, equipped with radiation detection instruments, mounted in the fuselage, flying low-altitude survey passes over the projected debris field. The Canadian Armed Forces provided the organizational backbone of the ground operation. The United States military provided technical expertise and equipment, particularly the specialized instruments needed to detect radioactive contamination from both the air and the ground. The operation was classified at a level that prevented any public disclosure while it was underway. Personnel involved were required to sign confidentiality agreements. Their families were told they were on a training exercise. The cover story was plausible enough that it held for several weeks, but you cannot conduct a large-scale military operation across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of Canadian wilderness without eventually attracting attention. By mid-February 1978, reporters had begun asking questions. The government acknowledged that a Soviet satellite had come down. It said recovery operations were underway. It said there was no danger to the public. It did not say that American military personnel were operating on Canadian soil under a classified bilateral agreement. It did not say that the contamination levels in certain areas of the debris field were substantially higher than what the public statement implied. And it did not say what some of the search teams had found in the second week of February in a location approximately 80 kilometers northeast of the community of Reliance, in territory so remote that it had not been visited by any documented outside observer in years. The reports from that site, dated February 11th and February 14th, 1978, appear in the early internal documentation of Operation Morning Light, and then, with a precision that strongly suggests deliberate action, disappear from subsequent versions of those same documents. The redacted versions released under Access to Information. Requests show blocks of text replaced by black bars, which is standard. What is not standard is that some of those documents also show evidence of page substitution, of pages in the official record that do not match the original pagination, that appear to have been inserted to replace removed material rather than simply redacted. What was at that site? The answer to that question has been the subject of speculation, of unofficial testimony from former search team members who have spoken to researchers over the years, and of at least 2 separate access to information requests that return documents so heavily redacted as to be effectively meaningless. What can be established from the available record is this: the site was placed under a restricted access designation that was not lifted until 1993, 15 years after the initial operation. Personnel who visited the site during the recovery operation were given additional medical monitoring that was not standard protocol for the rest of Operation Morning Light's teams, and a notation in one partially declassified logistics document refers to the site as requiring specialized containment protocols not applicable to standard debris recovery. That phrase, specialized containment protocols not applicable to standard debris recovery, is interesting for what it implies. Standard debris recovery, in the context of Operation Morning Light, already involved handling radioactively contaminated metal with protective equipment, careful bagging and labeling, transport in sealed containers, the full range of radiological safety procedures. If the site required specialized containment beyond that, the question becomes what was there that standard radiological containment was insufficient to address. The explanations that have been offered over the years range from the mundane to the extraordinary. The mundane explanation is that a particularly concentrated section of reactor core material landed in one location, creating a contamination level that required more intensive remediation than the scattered debris elsewhere. This is plausible. The fragmentation of the reactor core was not uniform, and it is entirely possible that a significant piece, perhaps the majority of the fuel mass, came down in one area. The extraordinary explanations, which you will find in various corners of the internet and in certain books that exist at the fringe of serious historical inquiry, go considerably further. Let us stay, for now, with what the documents actually show. The diplomatic dimension of the 1978 incident was handled almost entirely in secret, and the secrecy was deliberate and sustained. Within days of the re-entry, the Canadian government had formally protested to the Soviet Union through diplomatic channels, demanding compensation for the costs of the cleanup operation. The Soviet response was careful. They acknowledged the satellite had come down. They did not acknowledge any liability under international law. They provided technical information about the reactor that was so limited as to be nearly useless to the teams on the ground, who needed to know things like the specific isotopic composition of the fuel and the metallurgical properties of the containment vessel, neither of which the Soviets were willing to share. The negotiations that followed, conducted between Canadian and Soviet officials over a period of months, were not public. They were not reported in the press, The Canadians were seeking roughly $6 million in compensation, an amount that represented a portion of the actual costs of Operation Morning Light, which were considerably higher. The Soviets, after extended back-channel discussion, agreed to pay $3 million. The terms of that payment, the conditions attached to it, and what the Canadian government agreed not to pursue in exchange for it, are contained in documents that have been partially released but never fully made available to the public. What the partial releases show is suggestive. There are references to agreed limitations on what information Canada would make public about the nature of the recovered material. There are references to what a Canadian official described in one internal memo as an understanding about discretion regarding certain technical findings. There are references to ongoing consultations between Canadian and Soviet scientific delegations that were not announced publicly and whose subject matter is not specified in any released document. The Soviets paid the $3 million in April 1981, 3 years after the incident. Canada accepted it and issued a statement saying the matter was resolved. No member of the public had any way of knowing that the settlement contained provisions that constrained what the Canadian government was permitted to say about what had been found. The communities most directly affected by the crash of Cosmos 954 were the Dean and Inuit communities of the Northwest Territories. Lutzel Kay, Reliance, Baker Lake, Snowdrift, these are small remote communities where traditional land use, hunting, trapping, fishing remains central to daily life and survival. The territory across which the debris field was scattered was not empty. It was used land. It was land that people traveled across, harvested from, lived in relationship with, across generations. The warning protocols that the Canadian government had in place for emergencies involving remote Indigenous communities in 1978 were, to put it charitably, not robust. The infrastructure of communication that might have allowed a rapid, effective notification to communities in the affected area was simply not there. There were no telephones in many of the communities. Radio communication existed but was not reliable, and the government, for the reasons already discussed, had decided in any case not to issue a public warning before the satellite came down. The result was that the hunters from Lutzel Kay who found the first piece of debris were not warned. The families in Baker Lake whose land was directly under the eastern end of the debris corridor were not warned. The trappers working the country between Reliance and the east arm of Great Slave Lake were not warned. These were the people closest to the contamination. They were the ones who encountered the debris first, who in some cases handled it, who continued to hunt and fish and travel in the affected area because nobody had told them there was any reason not to. When Operation Morning Light search teams did reach these communities, the interactions were, by the accounts of community members who have spoken publicly in the decades since, often confused and inadequate. Teams arrived in force, conducted surveys, collected samples, and departed without clearly explaining what they had found or what the implications were. Medical assessments were conducted, but the results were not communicated in ways that community members could understand or act on. There was no follow-up program, or if there was one, it did not function effectively. The long-term health consequences, if any, of the contamination exposure experienced by community members in the affected area have never been comprehensively studied. This is partly because the data needed for such a study, accurate measurements of the contamination that existed in the days and weeks before Operation Morning Light reached the area, simply does not exist. The search teams arrived after community members had already been exposed. The baseline conditions could not be reconstructed after the fact, and the Canadian government, for reasons it has never fully explained, did not commission a long-term health monitoring program for the affected communities. The research that has been done by independent scientists and by community health workers operating with limited resources suggests that the communities closest to the debris field experienced elevated levels of certain cancers and immune disorders in the years following 1978. But the sample sizes are small, the confounding variables are numerous, and the absence of a proper baseline means it is impossible to establish causation with the kind of certainty that would compel government action or legal accountability. The government has consistently maintained that there is no evidence of health impacts attributable to Cosmos 954. The communities have consistently maintained that this is not the same as saying there was no impact. The nuclear payload aboard Cosmos 954 was, from a technical standpoint, one of the more concerning aspects of the incident. The reactor was a BES-5, a Soviet design that had been used in Roarsat satellites throughout the early 1970s. It operated on uranium-235, enriched to approximately 90%, which is weapons-grade enrichment. The reactor had been shut down automatically when the satellite began losing altitude, as designed, which meant that by the time of re-entry, it was in a cold, subcritical state. It was not going to detonate. That was never the risk. The risk was contamination, dispersion of radioactive material into the environment in ways that would create long-term exposure hazards. The specific form of the uranium fuel, the geometry of the fuel elements, the metallurgical composition of the cladding, the physical state of the material after fragmentation during re-entry. These were all things that the recovery teams needed to know, to understand how the material would behave in the environment, whether it would dissolve in water and enter the food chain through lake systems, whether it would remain as solid metal pieces that could be physically collected, whether it had oxidized during re-entry in ways that would cause fine particulate dispersal. The Soviets, as already noted, declined to provide this information in useful form. The American teams brought their own expertise, but that expertise was based on what they knew about reactor designs they were familiar with, which was not always the same as what the Soviets had done. Some of the assessments made during Operation Morning Light about the behavior of the material in the environment turned out, based on subsequent analysis, to have been optimistic. The material was more dispersible than initially assessed. The contamination in certain areas was more persistent. Some of the fine particulate material that had dispersed during re-entry had settled into lake sediments and river sediments in ways that created ongoing low-level contamination of aquatic food chains. These findings emerged over subsequent years through the work of independent researchers and through slow, incremental declassification of the original survey data. They did not change the government's public position, which remained that there was no significant danger to public health, but they did change the picture for the communities and the scientists who were paying attention. The Polar Continental Shelf Program, a Canadian federal agency responsible for logistics support for scientific research in the Arctic, played an interesting role in the aftermath of Operation Morning Light. The PCSP had established infrastructure at various points across the Canadian Arctic, including a base at Resolute Bay on Cornwallis Island that served as a hub for scientific operations across the high Arctic. In the weeks following the satellite crash, the PCSP infrastructure was used to support both the official recovery operation and a parallel scientific assessment that was conducted under different organizational auspices. This parallel assessment, which appears in internal documents under a designation that suggests it was distinct from Operation Morning Light proper, was focused specifically on the site northeast of Reliance that had been placed under the restricted access designation. The scientists involved were not the standard radiological assessment teams. Their institutional affiliations, in the documents where they appear at all, are partially obscured. Their reports, if they wrote reports, are not in any file that has been released. What the PCSP logistics records do show is that a series of flights were made to the restricted site between February and April 1978, carrying equipment described in the manifest as scientific instrumentation and samples. The return manifests list sealed containers of material categorized generically as recovered debris, but the weights and quantities do not match what would be expected from standard radiological material recovery. The discrepancies are not enormous, but they are consistent enough across enough separate flight records to suggest that something was being brought out of that site that was not being cataloged, the same way as the rest of the recovered material. By the end of 1978, Operation Morning Light had officially concluded. The government issued a final report that summarized the operation in terms that were, as already noted, careful and incomplete. Approximately 90% of the radioactive debris had been recovered, the report stated. This was a figure that subsequent independent analysis suggested was substantially overstated. The 10% that was not recovered included some of the most contaminated material, pieces that had come down in lake ice or in areas that were too remote or too dangerous to reach by ground. The debate about how much material was actually recovered and what happened to what was not has persisted ever since. Researchers who have spent years working through the declassified record have noted that the accounting of recovered material is internally inconsistent, that the weights and piece counts do not always add up, and that the geographic coverage of the survey, while extensive, left significant portions of the projected debris corridor either incompletely surveyed or not surveyed at all. There is a particular area of the debris field, roughly in the vicinity of Aberdeen Lake, in what is now Nunavut, that appears in early survey maps and then largely disappears from subsequent documentation. The reason for this is not clear. The area is remote enough that it would have been genuinely difficult to reach by ground in the winter of 1978, and the aerial surveys may not have provided sufficient resolution to characterize what was there. But the gap in the record is notable, and the area corresponds to a section of the original re-entry track where the satellite's fragmentation was, based on later reconstruction, particularly intense. The political consequences of the incident, at least within Canada, were muted. The government survived it. Trudeau's Liberals were already in political difficulty for other reasons, and the satellite affair, as it was sometimes called in the press, did not become the focus of sustained public outrage that might have forced a more complete reckoning. The opposition asked questions in Parliament. The government answered those questions with information that was accurate as far as it went and carefully incomplete. And then other issues came along, and the satellite affair receded. Internationally, the incident had more lasting consequences. It contributed directly to negotiations that produced the Convention on International Liability for Damage caused by space objects, which had actually been in force since 1972, but had never been tested in a case quite like this one. It also contributed to ongoing discussions about the design of nuclear-powered satellites, discussions that the Soviets participated in selectively and the Americans participated in with their own interests firmly in mind. The Soviet Union continued to fly Rorsat satellites after Cosmos 954. The next one, Cosmos 1176, was launched in April 1980. The design had been modified somewhat, but the fundamental architecture was the same. A nuclear reactor powering an ocean surveillance radar, orbiting at low altitude, eventually coming down. The question of what would happen when it did was still being answered in ways that depended on where it landed, who was there, and what the governments involved decided to say. In the years since 1978, a number of individuals who were directly involved in Operation Morning Light have spoken publicly about their experiences. Some of them have spoken through formal channels, through government inquiries and academic research projects. Others have spoken more informally to journalists, to researchers, to family members who later passed on what they were told. What emerges from these accounts is a picture that is broadly consistent with the official record in its broad outlines, but diverges from it in significant ways in its details. The search teams found more than the official reports described. The contamination in certain areas was more severe than the public statements acknowledged. The interactions with indigenous communities were worse than the government admitted, and the site northeast of Reliance was different from the rest of the debris field in ways that the people who were there found difficult to fully articulate. One former team member, speaking anonymously to a researcher in the late 1990s, described arriving at the restricted site and finding that the snow for a radius of approximately 40 meters around the main debris concentration had melted, despite temperatures that were well below freezing at the time. The melting had refrozen, creating a distinctive glassy surface that was visible from the air. The explanation offered by the senior personnel on site was that the debris piece, which was a substantial fragment of reactor casing, had retained enough residual heat from re-entry to melt the snow. This is not implausible for a very recent impact, but the satellite had come down more than 2 weeks before the team reached the site. 2 weeks is a long time for a piece of metal to retain enough heat to melt snow at temperatures of minus 30 Celsius. Another account from a former military pilot who flew survey missions over the debris field describes encountering an area in the northeastern portion of the field where his radiation detection instruments went into saturation, meaning they maxed out and could not provide a reliable reading at an altitude where he would not have expected such levels based on the other data he had collected. He reported this through official channels and was told to note it in his log and continue the mission. He does not know what follow-up, if any, was conducted at that location. These accounts are anecdotal. They cannot be verified against the official record in the way that documentary evidence can, both because the individuals have requested anonymity and because the specific sites and incidents they describe either do not appear in available documentation or appear in Forms 2, redacted to confirm or contradict the testimony, but they are consistent with each other in their general tenor, in the suggestion that what the official record describes is a simplified and in some respects sanitized version of what actually happened on the ground. The question of what the Canadian government owed the people most directly affected by the Cosmos 954 incident has been raised repeatedly over the decades and has never received a satisfactory answer. The indigenous communities of the Northwest Territories received no formal acknowledgement of the health risks they were exposed to, no compensation, no long-term health monitoring, no remediation of the areas of their traditional territory that remained contaminated. The hunters who found the first piece of debris and handled it without any protective equipment received no medical follow-up from the federal government beyond the initial inadequate assessment that was conducted days after their exposure. In 2008, on the 30th anniversary of the incident, a number of community leaders and researchers called on the federal government to commission a comprehensive review of the health and environmental impact of the satellite crash, to declassify the remaining restricted documents from Operation Morning Light, and to establish a compensation fund for communities that had been affected. The government of Stephen Harper did not respond substantively to these calls. The government of Justin Trudeau, which came to office in 2015, has made somewhat more information available through access to information processes, but the most sensitive documents remain restricted. The environmental legacy of the incident is also incompletely understood. The Canadian Arctic is a sensitive ecosystem where contamination can persist for very long periods. The lake and river systems across which the debris field extended are cold, slow-moving environments where radioactive isotopes, once they enter the sediment, can remain there for generations. The food chain in these systems, from aquatic invertebrates to fish, to the birds and mammals that feed on fish, to the human communities that depend on those animals, represents a pathway through which low-level contamination can concentrate over time. Independent environmental assessments conducted in the 1980s and 1990s by researchers working largely without government funding or support found evidence of elevated isotope levels in sediment cores taken from lakes within the debris corridor. The levels were not at what government standards defined as unsafe for human consumption, but they were measurably above background levels in ways that suggested ongoing, low-level input of radioactive material into the aquatic environment. Whether that material came from Cosmos 954 or from other sources, including the atmospheric nuclear testing that had been conducted by multiple countries through the 1950s and 1960s and had left a persistent global signature in Arctic sediments, was impossible to determine definitively without the kind of detailed isotopic fingerprinting that would have required government cooperation and resources that were not available. The story of Cosmos 954 sits within a broader context of Cold War secrecy in the Canadian Arctic that is worth understanding, because the satellite incident was not an isolated case. It was one episode in a longer history of things happening in that territory that the Canadian government chose not to fully disclose to the public. The DEW line stations, for example, have their own complicated legacy. The radar installations themselves were significant sources of contamination. The fuel storage, the waste disposal, the PCB containing equipment that was standard issue in that era and was disposed of in ways that would not be acceptable today. All of this left an environmental footprint across dozens of sites throughout the Canadian North. When the DEW line was phased out and replaced by the North Warning System in the 1980s, the remediation of the old sites was conducted under protocols that were, by the assessment of independent environmental scientists, inadequate. Some sites were cleaned up properly. Others were covered over, literally, with new materials placed on top of the contaminated soil, a remediation approach that defers rather than solves the problem. At the same time, the Canadian and American governments were conducting other operations in the Arctic that the public was not told about. Submarine operations beneath the Arctic ice were a standard feature of Cold War naval activity by both the United States and the Soviet Union, and the frequency and nature of American submarine activity in Canadian Arctic waters was not something that Canada publicly acknowledged, in part because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging that the United States was operating military vessels in territory whose status was disputed. The arrangement was, by all accounts, understood and accepted at senior levels of both governments, and not discussed publicly. The pattern, across these various cases, is consistent. Activities that would have been politically complicated if disclosed publicly were conducted under classification, with the understanding shared at senior levels of government and withheld from the public. The Canadian government's position was, in each case, that the security requirements of the Cold War justified the secrecy, that public disclosure would have created complications with alliance partners or provided information to adversaries or caused public panic without providing any practical benefit. These were not unreasonable arguments in the context of the time. They were also arguments that happened to be convenient, that happened to protect institutional interests and political comfort at the expense of transparency and accountability. The specific case of Cosmos 954 is distinctive for several reasons. It involved foreign contamination of Canadian territory, which raised sovereignty questions that the government was poorly positioned to handle forthrightly, given its interest in not antagonizing either the Soviets or the Americans. It directly affected indigenous communities in ways that reflected and compounded the already fraught relationship between the federal government and those communities. And it involved classified material from the debris site, the documentation from the restricted location northeast of Reliance that has still not been fully released. The full story of what was at that site may never be publicly known. The individuals who know are mostly in their 70s and 80s now, if they are still alive. The documents that would explain it are held in files that remain restricted or may have been destroyed. The physical evidence from the site, whatever was taken out in those sealed containers on the flights logged in the PCSP records, is presumably sitting in a storage facility somewhere under a classification designation that will not expire for years or decades if it expires at all. What we can say, based on the available evidence, is that something at that site was treated differently from everything else that was recovered in Operation Morning Light, that the differential treatment was deliberate and sustained, that it involved personnel and protocols that were distinct from the rest of the operation, and that the information about it was systematically removed from the accessible record in a way that required active effort, not just routine classification. That is a pattern that, in the history of government secrecy, usually means one of two things. Either what was found was more contaminated and more dangerous than the official story acknowledges, which has significant implications for the communities that lived and worked in the surrounding area and for the environmental legacy of the crash. Or what was found was unusual in some way that went beyond the standard parameters of a debris recovery operation, something that did not fit neatly into the official framework for what Cosmos 954 was and what it was carrying. The first possibility is the more straightforward one and the more depressing. It suggests that the government, faced with evidence of more serious contamination than it was willing to publicly acknowledge, chose to manage that evidence quietly, to contain it within classification rather than deal with its implications. This would be consistent with the pattern of behavior the government demonstrated throughout the incident, the delayed warning, the inadequate community engagement, the incomplete public statements, the terms of the Soviet settlement. It would make Cosmos 950 another chapter in the long history of governments deciding that what their citizens do not know cannot hurt them politically, even when it can hurt them physically. The second possibility is harder to evaluate because it requires speculation about what exactly an unusual finding at that site might have looked like. The accounts of the team members who were there, the melted snow at temperatures that should not have produced melting, the instrument saturation at altitude, these are data points that do not obviously fit the first explanation. Concentrated radioactive material does generate heat, but the levels involved in the Cosmos 954 debris were not, based on what is known about the BES-5 reactor's fuel load, sufficient to produce the kind of sustained thermal effect described by the team member who spoke to researchers in the 1990s, not 2 weeks after the initial impact. This is where the documentary record runs out and the interpretive possibilities expand. Some researchers, working in the space between what the documents show and what the accounts describe, have argued that the reactor casing fragment at the restricted site may have been more intact than the fragmentation model predicted, that it may have retained enough fissile material to sustain a very low-level reaction in the weeks after impact, which would account for both the thermal effect and the radiation levels that saturated the detection instruments. This is a technically coherent explanation. It is also one that, if correct, would represent a significantly more serious incident than the government ever acknowledged, because a sustained fission reaction in an uncontrolled environment is exactly the kind of situation that radiological safety protocols are designed to prevent. Others have gone further, arguing that the classified material from the site represents evidence of something that was not simply a piece of Soviet reactor technology. These arguments tend to become less coherent the further they go from the documentary record, and I'm not going to follow them into territory that the evidence does not support. What I will say is that the deliberate removal of information from the accessible record, the sustained restriction of the site for 15 years, and the terms of the Soviet settlement all suggest that the Canadian government had reasons for its secrecy that went beyond routine operational security, reasons it has never found it necessary to fully explain. 46 years have passed since January 24th, 1978. The children who were alive in Lutzel Cay and Baker Lake when the satellite came down are now middle-aged adults. The soldiers and scientists and pilots who worked Operation Morning Light are in the last decades of their lives. The diplomatic world that produced the secret settlement between Canada and the Soviet Union no longer exists, the Soviet Union having dissolved in 1991, though the Russian Federation inherited its diplomatic archives and its classification designations and has shown no inclination to open either to public scrutiny. The Canadian Arctic itself has changed dramatically. Climate change has transformed the landscape in ways that complicate the already difficult task of assessing the long-term environmental legacy of the 1978 crash. Permafrost is thawing. Lake levels are changing. The sediment conditions that preserved contamination in one form for decades are shifting. Whatever material from the cosmos, 954 debris, is still in the environment, wherever it is. The processes that govern its behavior are no longer the same processes that governed it in 1978. The communities of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut have, in the decades since the incident, built stronger political institutions and stronger advocacy capacity. The land claim agreements and self-government agreements negotiated in the 1990s and 2000s have given Indigenous governments in the region more tools to demand accountability than they had in 1978. Community-led environmental monitoring programs have developed, though they operate with limited resources and without the access to classified government data that would make them most effective. The calls for full disclosure and full remediation have not stopped. They come up regularly in parliamentary hearings, in the reports of Indigenous rights organizations, in the work of environmental groups that have made the ongoing legacy of Cold War contamination in the Canadian North a focus of their advocacy. The government responds each time with statements that acknowledge some portion of what happened, concede some portion of the critique, and stop well short of the full accounting that advocates are seeking. There are access to information requests related to Operation Morning Light and to the restricted site northeast of Reliance that have been outstanding for years, some of them for decades. The standard response, when the requested documents have not simply been deemed non-existent, is that the material remains restricted for reasons of national security or international relations, the latter designation presumably relating to ongoing sensitivities in the Canada-Russia relationship that make releasing information from the Soviet settlement still diplomatically inconvenient. What would the full story tell us if it were available? Based on what we can reconstruct from the partial record, it would tell us that the contamination of Canadian territory by the Cosmos 954 crash was more extensive and more persistent than the government publicly acknowledged in 1978 or since. It would tell us that the communities most directly affected received inadequate warning, inadequate assessment, and inadequate follow-up. It would tell us that the Soviet settlement contained provisions that constrained what Canada could say about what was found, provisions that served Soviet interests and Canadian political interests, and the interests of nobody who lived within 1,000 kilometers of the debris field. And it would tell us something about the restricted site, something specific and documented about what was there and why it was treated differently from everything else. What that something is, the available evidence, is not sufficient to determine. It is the most important missing piece of a story that is already, based on what we can establish, a significant case study in the abuse of government secrecy. The pattern of behavior documented in the Cosmos 9v4 case, the delayed warning, the managed disclosure, the classified settlement, the inadequate community engagement, the restricted site, the persistent refusal to fully declassify, is not unique to this incident. It is a pattern that appears in other Cold War incidents, in the management of nuclear testing fallout, in the handling of various classified military programs that operated in or over indigenous territory. What makes the Cosmos 954 case distinctive is that it happened on Canadian soil, that it was caused by a foreign power, and that it occurred at a moment when the Canadian government was actively asserting its sovereignty over the very territory it was failing to protect. That contradiction between the public assertion of sovereign responsibility and the private management of sovereign failure is worth sitting with. Canada in 1978 was telling the world in international forums and bilateral negotiations that it had the right and the capability to govern its Arctic territory, to protect it, to speak for it. At the same time, it was allowing a foreign power satellite to contaminate that territory, allowing American military forces to operate in that territory under a classified agreement, and failing to adequately notify or protect the indigenous communities who actually lived in and depended on that territory. Sovereignty, in that formulation, was a claim made for external purposes. The territory and the people in it were, when the claim was tested by an actual emergency, treated as something other than the primary concern. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It is, however, the conclusion that the available evidence supports, and it is a conclusion that matters not just as history, but as context for ongoing discussions about what Canada owes to the communities affected by the Cosmos 9v4 incident, about what the government's obligations are when it has failed to protect its citizens and has managed that failure through secrecy for decades, and about what full accountability rather than managed disclosure would actually look like. The declassification of the remaining Cosmos 954 documents, including whatever material relates to the restricted site northeast of Reliance, would be a start. It would not be an answer to everything. Documents do not restore health, cannot remediate contamination, cannot return the years of uncertainty experienced by the communities in the affected area, but they would allow the people most affected to know what happened to them and to their land. They would allow the historical record to be complete, and they would allow the Canadian public to make an informed assessment of what its government did, in their name, in the Arctic winter of 1978. That is not a small thing. In a democracy, the right to know what was done in your name is foundational. The information that was withheld from Canadians about Cosmos 954 was withheld in part for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine security requirements and everything to do with political convenience. The intelligence community and the diplomatic establishment found it easier to manage the story than to tell it. The communities that paid the price for that convenience have been asking for accountability for almost 50 years. They are still asking. The question of whether they will ever get a complete answer is, at this point, uncertain. The passage of time works against disclosure. The individuals who know the most are aging. The institutional memories are fading. The political will to revisit an incident from nearly half a century ago, to acknowledge failures that cannot be attributed to any current government, to open a file that can only create complications, is difficult to generate in a political environment focused entirely on present problems. But the incomplete record leaves questions that are not merely historical. If material from the Cosmos 954 debris is still in the environment, still in lake sediments, still in the food chain of communities that depend on those lakes, that is a present concern, not a historical one. If the terms of the Soviet settlement constrained what Canada could do to protect its citizens, understanding those terms is relevant to understanding what legal or diplomatic remedies might still be available. And if the restricted site contained something that was categorized and handled differently from standard radioactive debris, knowing what that was matters for the ongoing environmental assessment of the area. These are not idle questions. They are questions that the available evidence raises and that the available evidence cannot answer. The answers are in the files that remain classified. The decision about whether to release them belongs to the current Canadian government, which inherited both the files and the obligation that comes with them. What we know is this. In January 1978, a Soviet nuclear-powered satellite fell on Canadian territory. The government knew it was coming and did not warn the public. The communities most at risk received no adequate notification. The cleanup operation was partially classified and involved American military forces operating under a secret agreement. The environmental contamination was more extensive and persistent than publicly acknowledged. The Soviet settlement contained undisclosed provisions, and at one site in the Northwest Territories, something was found and removed and classified in a way that has never been adequately explained. That is the documented story. The undocumented story, the part that remains in the restricted files and in the memories of the people who were there, may be more or less dramatic than the documented version. It may confirm the straightforward interpretation that the restricted site was simply more contaminated than the government wanted to admit, or it may contain something that genuinely changes the picture. There is no way to know until the files are opened. Until they are, the story of Cosmos 954 remains what it has been for 46 years, a case study in government secrecy and its costs, a story about a territory and its people that were not adequately protected, a history that is officially closed and actually not. If you found this worth your time, share it with someone who cares about what governments choose not to say. The more people who know about cases like this, the harder it is to keep them buried. Subscribe if you're not already here. And if you know something about this case, if you have a connection to the communities affected, if you were involved in Operation Morning Light, if you have ever come across documentation that changes what I have described here, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment, send a message. This story is not finished, and the people who can finish it are, in some cases, still out there. The Canadian Arctic has been carrying this for a long time. It is past time for the rest of Canada to carry it too. There is a particular kind of loneliness to the Canadian subarctic in January. The light comes late and leaves early, and in the period between, it sits low on the horizon, pale and without warmth, illuminating a landscape that is almost entirely white. The boreal forest thins out as you go north and eventually gives way to open tundra, to frozen lakes indistinguishable from frozen land, to a silence so complete and so vast that it can feel less like the absence of sound and more like its own kind of presence. The people who have lived in this country for thousands of years understand it on terms that are different from those of the governments that claim sovereignty over it. The Dene nations and the Inuit have accumulated, across uncountable generations, a knowledge of this landscape that is specific and detailed and practical in ways that no government survey or military operation has ever replicated. They know the ice, they know the animals, They know the weather in all its local and seasonal particularity. They know, which is relevant to this story, what the land looks like when something is wrong with it. In the months following January 1978, the people of the communities closest to the debris field noticed things. Ice that was discolored in ways that had no ordinary explanation. Animals that behaved unusually, that were found dead in areas where they should not have been dying. Fish that tasted wrong, in the considered opinion of people who had been eating fish from those lakes their entire lives. Waterfowl nesting sites that were abandoned after birds had already settled in them, which in itself was not unprecedented, but which happened in several locations along the debris corridor in the spring of 1978 in ways that older community members found noteworthy. None of these observations were systematically collected. The communities had no mechanism for reporting them to any authority that would have taken them seriously, and the relationship between those communities and the federal government in 1978 was not one that would have encouraged the attempt. The knowledge stayed local, passed in conversation among community members, contributing to a sense, shared across the affected communities, that the government had not told them everything, and that the land itself was confirming that something had happened that was larger than what the official accounts described. This oral tradition of the aftermath, imprecise by the standards of scientific documentation, but consistent across communities and consistent with what independent researchers have subsequently found in the environmental record, represents a category of evidence that has been consistently undervalued in official assessments of the Cosmos 954 incident. The Canadian government's position, as already noted, is that there is no evidence of health or environmental impacts attributable to the crash. The community's position is that the evidence they have, the things they observed and experienced in the months and years after January 1978, was never taken seriously enough to be properly collected, analyzed, or included in any official accounting. The gap between these positions is not simply a matter of disagreement about facts. It is a matter of disagreement about what counts as evidence, about whose knowledge is considered valid, and about who bears the burden of proof when a government's actions have harmed a community. These are not new questions in the history of Indigenous relations with the Canadian state. They are questions that have been asked in the context of residential schools, of resource extraction, of environmental contamination, of a long series of cases in which Indigenous communities have borne the costs of decisions made by governments that did not adequately consult them, did not adequately compensate them, and did not adequately acknowledge the harm done. Cosmos 954 is one chapter in that longer history. It has not received the same sustained public attention as some other chapters, partly because it happened in the far north, out of sight of most Canadians, and partly because the classification of much of the relevant documentation has made it difficult to establish the full picture. But it belongs in the same historical context, and its meaning cannot be fully understood apart from that context. The science of what actually happened to the Cosmos 954 reactor during re-entry has been the subject of ongoing research since 1978. The initial assessment, conducted under Operation Morning Light and described in the partially declassified final report, characterized the re-entry as having produced near total combustion of the reactor fuel, with only a small fraction surviving to reach the ground in concentrated form. Subsequent analysis has challenged this characterization. A research paper published in the journal Nuclear Technology in 1990 by a team at the Chalk River Nuclear Laboratories in Ontario, working from physical samples collected during Operation Morning Light that had been held in storage, found evidence that the fuel fragmentation pattern was inconsistent with the near-total combustion model. The isotopic ratios in the recovered material and the physical form of the fuel particles suggested that a significant portion of the fuel had undergone a complex sequence of high-temperature reactions during re-entry that produced multiple distinct physical forms, some of which were more dispersible and more bioavailable than the initial assessment had recognized. The practical implication of this finding was that the contamination in the debris corridor was more varied in its distribution than the survey data had captured. Fine particulate material, capable of being transported by wind and water and of entering food chains in ways that larger solid fragments could not, may have been deposited across a much wider area than the debris field that Operation Morning Light had surveyed. The survey had been designed to find solid pieces of material that could be physically collected. It was less well equipped to detect or assess the distribution of fine particulate contamination. This research did not reach a wide public audience. It was published in a technical journal with a limited readership, cited in subsequent technical literature, and never translated into any government policy or assessment update. The communities in the affected area have not, as far as any public record shows, been informed of its findings. The question of how much of the Cosmos 954 fuel is still in the environment, in what form and in what locations, is one that cannot be answered with confidence on the basis of currently available information. This is partly a matter of the inadequacy of the original survey, and partly a matter of the subsequent changes in the Arctic environment that make retrospective assessment difficult. What can be said is that the claim made in the 1978 final report and repeated in government statements since, that the situation has been fully characterized and that there is no ongoing concern, is not supported by the scientific literature on the subject. The political economy of secrecy in the Cosmos 954 case is worth examining separately, because it illustrates something important about how governments make decisions about disclosure when the interests at stake are multiple and conflicting. In January 1978, the Canadian government faced a situation in which full transparency would have created serious complications on several fronts simultaneously. First, disclosing that a Soviet satellite carrying a nuclear reactor had contaminated Canadian territory would have raised questions about Canadian sovereignty and Canadian protective capacity that the government was not well positioned to answer. Canada could not have prevented the satellite from falling where it did, but publicly acknowledging that Canadian territory had been contaminated by a foreign power's nuclear payload without any warning to the public and without an immediate, effective response would have been politically damaging. Second, disclosing the classified bilateral agreement with the United States under which American military forces were operating on Canadian soil would have created exactly the kind of sovereignty complications that the Trudeau government had been trying to avoid in its Arctic policy. The whole point of the Canadian position on Arctic sovereignty was that Canada governed its northern territories. Acknowledging that it was relying on American military assistance to deal with an emergency on its own soil would have undercut that position. Third, the terms of the Soviet settlement, whatever they were in full, appear to have involved Canadian commitments about what information would be made public. Releasing those terms or releasing information that violated them would have had diplomatic consequences that the government wished to avoid. Fourth, full disclosure of the extent of the contamination and the inadequacy of the warning and community engagement protocols would have created legal and moral obligations toward the affected Indigenous communities that the government had neither the political will nor perhaps the financial resources to meet. Each of these considerations, taken separately, might have been manageable. Together, they created a situation in which the path of least political resistance was managed disclosure, partial acknowledgement, and long-term classification. The government chose that path. It has been on that path for 46 years. The costs of that choice have been borne, as in so many similar cases, by the people who had the least power in the situation. the communities of the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, the hunters who found the debris, the families who lived and worked in the contaminated territory, the children who grew up in communities that may have experienced elevated background radiation for years afterward. They bore the costs. The government managed the story. I want to spend some time on the specific geography of the incident, because geography matters in understanding what happened and what was not possible in the response. The debris field for Cosmos 954 stretched across territory that is, by the standards of most of the inhabited world, extraordinarily remote. The nearest significant population center to the eastern end of the debris corridor is Yellowknife, the capital of the Northwest Territories, which in 1978 had a population of roughly 10,000 people. Yellowknife is connected to the south by a single highway, the Mackenzie Highway, and in winter that highway is the only reliable land connection between Yellowknife and the rest of Canada. The communities within or adjacent to the debris field itself, Lutzel Cay, Reliance, Baker Lake, were connected to the outside world in winter only by air. There were no roads. The radio communications available were limited in capacity and not always reliable. The infrastructure for moving people and equipment into and out of these communities was, in 1978, modest. Charter flights operated from Yellowknife. That was essentially the option. This geographic reality shaped everything about the response. It made the logistics of Operation Morning Light extraordinarily difficult, requiring the forward basing of aircraft and personnel at remote locations and the constant management of fuel and supply chains across vast distances. It meant that reaching all parts of the debris corridor and surveying them adequately was genuinely not possible with the resources and the time frame available, and it meant that the communities within the corridor were, from the government's perspective, at a practical remove from the political and media attention that would have attended a similar incident in southern Canada. The geography also shaped the experience of the communities. Remoteness, in this context, meant a dependence on local resources, on hunting and fishing and trapping that was more complete than it would have been for communities connected to supply chains and supermarkets. If the fish in a lake were contaminated, and the community depended on that lake for a significant portion of its food supply, and the government had not told them there was any reason to avoid eating the fish, the exposure pathway was both obvious and unavoidable. The assessment of what exposure pathways existed, what populations were at risk, through which routes of contamination, and what protective measures would have been appropriate, is another area where the available documentation is inadequate. The Operation Morning Light assessment focused primarily on direct external radiation exposure, on the gamma radiation emitted by the debris pieces, which was the most immediately measurable form of risk. The assessment of internal exposure, from inhalation of fine particulate material, from ingestion of contaminated food or water, was less rigorous, and based on the 1990 Chalk River research, was based on an incomplete understanding of the physical form of the contamination. The communities in the debris corridor were not, for the most part, consulted about what routes of exposure were relevant to their situation. The assessment framework was designed by people who understood radiation physics, but who did not have detailed knowledge of how these specific communities actually used the land, what they ate, how they obtained their water, what their patterns of movement across the landscape were. A technically competent assessment applied to an inadequate understanding of the exposure scenario produces results that may be technically correct within their assumptions but wrong about the actual situation. The oral history of the affected communities suggests that the actual situation involved exposure routes that were not adequately captured in the official assessment. People who were fishing through the ice on lakes within the debris corridor in the weeks after the crash. People whose snowmobile routes took them repeatedly through areas of elevated contamination. Children playing in snow that may have contained fine particulate material from the re-entry. None of these were assessed with any rigor. None of the people involved received any meaningful guidance or follow-up. The second major area where the geographic remoteness of the incident shaped its aftermath is in the political economy of attention. Incidents that happen to visible communities, to communities with media access and political connections, and the ability to create sustained public pressure, receive different responses than incidents that happen in remote places to communities that are easy to ignore. This is not a Canadian problem specifically. It is a universal feature of how political systems respond to harm. The harm that is easiest to see, that is most proximate to the centers of political power, that is experienced by the communities most capable of demanding accountability, receives the most attention and the most resources. The communities of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut in 1978 were among the least visible in Canada. They were small, remote, predominantly Indigenous, operating in a political environment in which Indigenous voices carried very little weight in federal decision-making. The land claims negotiations that would eventually give these communities more political standing were years away from conclusion. The institutions of Indigenous self-government that now provide mechanisms for advocacy and accountability were not yet in place. The communities were, in the political geography of 1978 Canada, easy to manage from a distance. This has changed, and it is worth acknowledging that it has changed. The land claims agreements, the self-government agreements, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and its incorporation into Canadian law, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and its calls to action. These have all created a different political context for the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous communities. The communities affected by Cosmos 954 and their successors now have more tools, more standing, and more allies than they had in 1978. Whether those tools will be sufficient to produce a full accounting of what happened is still an open question. The government has demonstrated over 4.5 decades a consistent preference for managing the Cosmos 954 story rather than telling it. The political incentives for full disclosure remain limited. The cost, in political and diplomatic terms, of opening the files and releasing everything remains higher than the government has been willing to pay, and the communities, despite their increased standing, are still fighting from a position of informational disadvantage, still trying to establish what happened to them from outside the archive that contains the definitive answers. The international dimension of the Cosmos 954 incident extended beyond the bilateral relationship with the Soviet Union. It had implications for the emerging framework of international space law, for the relationships between Canada and other NATO allies, and for the broader question of what rules should govern the operation of nuclear-powered satellites in Earth orbit. The Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects, which had been in force since 1972, was the relevant legal framework. Canada used it to pursue its compensation claim against the Soviet Union, making the Cosmos 954 case the first formal invocation of the treaty in a real-world incident. The outcome of that invocation, the $3 million settlement under undisclosed terms, was technically a success in that Canada received some compensation, but the amount was a fraction of actual costs. The terms constrained future Canadian disclosures, and the precedent set for how such cases would be handled was not, from Canada's perspective, particularly favorable. The lessons drawn from the incident by the international community focused primarily on technical questions, on whether nuclear-powered satellites should be permitted to fly in low Earth orbit, on what design requirements might reduce the risk of a future re-entry, contaminating inhabited territory. These discussions, conducted in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and in bilateral diplomatic channels, produced some incremental improvements in safety standards, but did not result in a prohibition on nuclear-powered satellites, a prohibition that the Soviet Union, which had an extensive program of ocean surveillance satellites depending on reactor power, would never have agreed to. The Soviet Rorsat program continued until 1988. Several satellites were deorbited in controlled maneuvers that successfully placed them in high parking orbits, where the reactors would remain safely out of the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Others were deorbited in ways that were less fully controlled. None of them contaminated inhabited territory in the way Cosmos 954 had, which was partly a matter of improved procedures and partly a matter of luck. The American government, which had its own nuclear-powered space systems, was involved in the Cosmos 954 case in ways that went beyond the bilateral assistance agreement for Operation Morning Light. American intelligence agencies had been tracking Cosmos 954 from its launch and had detailed information about its design, its nuclear payload, and its likely behavior during re-entry. Some of that information was shared with Canada, some was not. The basis on which those sharing decisions were made has never been fully explained, and the question of whether American agencies withheld information that would have been relevant to protecting Canadian communities has never been formally investigated. The American interest in limiting what was publicly disclosed about the incident was not purely altruistic. The United States had its own nuclear-powered satellites, its own classified space programs, and its own interest in the principle that the details of space-based nuclear systems should not be matters of public record. A full public accounting of Cosmos 954 would have created pressure for a full public accounting of American systems as well, pressure that American agencies were not eager to face. The relationship between Canadian and American intelligence and military agencies in the management of the Cosmos 954 incident is one of the areas where the documentary record is most opaque. The agreements under which American forces operated in Canada during Operation Morning Light have not been released. The intelligence sharing arrangements that govern what each country knew and when it knew it have not been released. The consultations between senior officials of the two governments about what to disclose and what to withhold have not been released. What is available makes clear that there was extensive consultation and that the decisions about disclosure were made jointly rather than independently. The terms of those joint decisions are not public. This matters because it complicates the question of accountability. If the decision not to warn Canadian communities was made jointly with American officials, and if that decision was influenced by American interest in limiting public disclosure of information about nuclear-powered satellites, then the accountability for the consequences of that decision is not solely Canadian. The American government has never been required to account for its role in the management of the Cosmos 954 incident, and the prospect that it will be required to do so at this point is remote. The 46th anniversary of the crash passed in January 2024 without significant official attention in Canada. There were commemorations in some of the affected communities. There were articles in some of the northern and indigenous media outlets that cover the story regularly. There was no government statement, no announcement of new declassification, no response to the outstanding access to information requests that continue to wait in the queue. The story of Cosmos 954 is, in a sense, still being written. The declassification process is ongoing, even if it is slow and incomplete. Environmental research in the affected area continues, though with limited resources. The communities continue to carry the knowledge, of what happened to them and to press, through whatever channels are available, for recognition and accountability. The restricted site northeast of Reliance remains the most compelling unanswered question. Whatever was there in February 1978, whatever was taken out in sealed containers and classified and held in restricted storage for decades, it was important enough to be treated differently from everything else in one of the largest classified recovery operations in North American history. The people who made the decision to treat it differently knew what was there. Some of them are still alive. Whether they will speak, whether the documents will be released, whether the full story will ever be told, those are questions to which the answers are not yet known. What is known is that the Canadian government has, for 46 years, maintained that the story it told in 1978 is essentially complete, that the gaps and inconsistencies in the record are matters of routine classification rather than active concealment, that the communities affected have been adequately informed, and that there is nothing more to know. The documentary evidence, partial and fragmentary as it is, suggests that none of those claims are fully accurate. The story of what fell from the sky over the Northwest Territories on January 24th, 1978, is not finished. The archives have not all been opened. The environmental record has not been fully read. The community knowledge has not been fully collected or taken seriously. The diplomatic record of what was agreed and what was withheld has not been fully disclosed. And somewhere in the Canadian Arctic, in the sediment of a lake, in the permafrost of a tundra slope, in a storage facility under a classification designation that will not expire for years, in the memory of an aging former soldier or scientist or pilot who signed a confidentiality agreement almost half a century ago, the rest of the story is still waiting. It has been waiting for a long time. The people who need it most have been waiting longer. There is a piece of evidence that has received relatively little attention in the mainstream accounts of the Cosmos 954 incident, and it comes from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1979, a year after the crash, a graduate student in geology at the University of Alberta named David Carrington was conducting fieldwork in the Northwest Territories as part of his doctoral research on glaciofluvial sediment deposits. His work was not connected to the satellite incident. He was studying ancient drainage patterns, looking at the geological record of how water had moved through the landscape during and after the last ice age. His fieldwork took him into the region northeast of Great Slave Lake, into territory that overlapped with the eastern portion of the Cosmos 954 debris field. He did not know this at the time. The satellite crash had been covered in the news, but the specific geography of the debris field had not been publicly disclosed in detail, and Carrington was not particularly following the story. He was looking at rocks and sediment, taking samples, making measurements. What he found in one area that his field notes locate approximately 60 kilometers northeast of Reliance was something that puzzled him enough to note it carefully. A section of lakeshore, perhaps 200 meters in length, where the vegetation was absent in a pattern he did not recognize from any geological process he was familiar with. Not the random die-off of individual plants you might expect from frost, damage, or drought. A relatively clean, roughly circular clearing in the otherwise continuous low tundra. Vegetation, with the vegetation at the margins of the clearing showing signs of stress that looked, to his eye, more chemical than mechanical. The soil in the clearing, when he sampled it, was anomalously dark and had a faintly metallic smell. He took samples, noted the location, photographed it with the film camera he carried for his field work, and moved on. The anomaly did not fit into the framework of his geological research, and he had no particular basis for interpreting it. He wrote it up in his field notes with a question mark and a notation that it warranted further investigation. Carrington finished his doctorate, submitted his thesis in 1981, and moved on to a career in geological consulting. The field notes from the 1979 survey were archived, as such materials routinely are, and sat in the University of Alberta's Geological Archive for years. In 2003, a researcher working on the environmental history of the Cosmos 954 incident was going through geological survey records from the Northwest Territories in the years following 1978, looking for any independent observations that might shed light on the distribution and persistence of contamination. She found Carrington's field notes, she found his description and his coordinates, and she recognized that his location was within the general vicinity of the restricted site, identified in the Operation Morning Light documentation. She contacted Carrington, who was by then retired and living in British Columbia. He confirmed what his notes said. He still had the photographs, slightly faded but legible, and he told her something that was not in the notes. He told her that when he had returned from that field season and mentioned the anomaly casually to a colleague at the university, the colleague had told him to forget about it, that anything odd in that part of the Northwest Territories in 1979 was probably connected to the satellite and was not something he wanted to be involved with. He had taken that advice. He had never formally reported the observation or investigated further. The researcher published her findings in a regional academic journal in 2004 in an article that received modest attention in the specialized community. Of researchers working on Cold War environmental history, but essentially none in the broader public discourse, the Canadian government did not respond to the article. The questions it raised about the location, extent, and persistence of the contamination from the restricted site were not addressed in any official forum. Carrington's observation and the vegetation die-off pattern he documented is consistent with the kind of environmental effect that high-level radioactive contamination can produce over time. If the material at the restricted site was more concentrated and more persistent than the official account acknowledges, and if it was not fully removed during Operation Morning Light, then a year later, a geologist might well have observed exactly what Carrington describes. The absence of vegetation, the chemical smell, the anomalous soil color, these are consistent with a site that had received a significant dose of radioactive contamination and had not recovered. This is not proof. A field observation by a geologist working outside his area of expertise, photographed on film that has since degraded, located only approximately by coordinates noted in a field notebook, is not the kind of evidence that settles a scientific question. But it is a data point. It is an independent observation that fits the pattern suggested by the classified documentation, the specialized containment protocols, the instrument saturation, the restricted access designation. And it is, like so many other data points in this case, a piece of evidence that has not been adequately followed up by any organization with the resources and the authority to do so. The history of the Canadian Arctic in the Cold War period contains other cases that provide relevant context for understanding how the government managed information about hazardous activities in remote Northern Territory. The Cambridge Bay radar station, one of the DEW line installations, was eventually found to have significant PCB contamination in its soil, contamination that had accumulated over decades of operation and had not been adequately disclosed to the community. The cleanup, when it eventually happened, was partial and inadequate. The community of Cambridge Bay lived with the contamination and its consequences for years before any substantive remediation occurred. The Saglec DW line site in Labrador is another example. PCB contamination discovered in the 1990s was found to have been present for decades, had entered the local food chain through caribou and other wildlife, and had exposed indigenous communities to levels of contamination that had never been disclosed or assessed. The government-funded cleanup was expensive and still not complete as of the early 2000s, and the health consequences for the communities were never systematically studied. These cases share a pattern with the Cosmos 954 incident, hazardous activities, or events in remote Northern Territory, inadequate warning and community engagement, management of information rather than full disclosure, slow and incomplete remediation, long delays before acknowledgement, and even longer delays before any form of accountability. Indigenous communities bearing disproportionate costs. The pattern is not accidental. It reflects structural features of the relationship between the Canadian state and its northern territories, and northern Indigenous populations that have been present throughout the post-war period, and that the various reforms of recent decades have modified but not eliminated. The North, in the political geography of Canada, has always been simultaneously important and peripheral, important to national identity and sovereignty claims, peripheral to the political calculations and the institutional attention of a government based in Ottawa and oriented toward the concerns of the southern population centers. This structural peripherality meant, in practice, that the standards applied to activities in the North were consistently lower than they would have been if the same activities had occurred in southern Canada. The contamination levels that were acceptable in the subarctic were not levels that would have been acceptable in Ontario or British Columbia. The community engagement processes that were considered adequate in Lutselk'e were not processes that would have been considered adequate in any southern Canadian city. The secrecy that was maintained about nuclear contamination in the Northwest Territories was secrecy that would have been much harder to maintain if the contamination had occurred somewhere with better media access and stronger political connections. There is a case to be made, and it has been made by Indigenous rights advocates and by historians of the Canadian North, that this differential application of standards is not merely negligence, but is itself a form of discrimination, that the consistent pattern of applying lower standards of care and lower standards of transparency to Indigenous and Northern communities reflects and perpetuates a valuation of those communities as less important than Southern Canadian communities. This argument is difficult to refute on the basis of the historical record. The evidence that lower standards were applied is clear. The mechanisms that produce those lower standards are embedded in the institutional structure of Canadian federalism in ways that have been only partially addressed by subsequent reforms. The Cosmos 954 incident in this reading is not primarily a story about a Soviet satellite or a classified recovery operation or an incomplete government disclosure. It is a story about a government's relationship with a part of its territory and a group of its citizens, a relationship in which those citizens were consistently treated as less than fully deserving of the protection and transparency that the government was obligated to provide. That is a harder story to tell, because it does not have a villain in the conventional sense. There was no individual decision maker who chose to harm the communities of the Northwest Territories. There were many individual decision makers who made choices, each of which was, in isolation, rationalized as the best available option, given the constraints of the situation. The warning would have been difficult to deliver, and the public disclosure would have been politically complicated, and the satellite settlement required discretion, and the classified documents were classified for reasons that were not entirely pretextual. Each choice had a rationale. The cumulative effect of those choices was that the communities bore the costs, and the government managed the story. This is how institutional harm typically works. Not through a single decision to do wrong, but through a series of decisions, each individually defensible, whose aggregate effect is to consistently prioritize the interests of the powerful over the interests of the vulnerable. The Canadian government in 1978 was not uniquely evil or uniquely careless. It was operating as governments typically operate, within institutional frameworks that made certain choices easier than others, and that consistently made transparency and community accountability harder than secrecy and management. Understanding this does not excuse what happened. It helps explain how it happened and why it is likely to happen again in similar circumstances unless the institutional frameworks themselves are changed. The reforms of recent decades, the land claims agreements, the self-government agreements, the statutory requirements for consultation, the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, have modified some of the institutional features that made the Cosmos 954 response possible. Whether they have modified them enough, whether the next incident of this type would be handled fundamentally differently, is a question that cannot be answered in advance. It can only be answered by what actually happens. The declassification timeline for Operation Morning Light documents has been, as noted, slow and incomplete. Documents released in the 1990s through access to information requests revealed the basic structure of the operation and confirmed many of the facts described in this account. Documents released in the 2000s provided additional detail on the environmental survey and on some aspects of the diplomatic negotiations. Documents sought through more recent requests have either been released in heavily redacted form or have been denied on the grounds of ongoing national security sensitivities. The argument that documents from 1978 relating to a satellite that no longer exists, operated by a country that no longer exists, under a classified agreement with a diplomatic context that has long since been superseded, still pose genuine national security risks in 2024 is not a compelling one on its face. But governments tend to use the broadest available classification grounds when releasing documents would create political embarrassment, and the remaining Operation Morning Light documents appear to fall into that category. An access to information appeal currently working its way through the Canadian system, filed by a coalition of researchers and Indigenous rights organizations, is seeking the declassification of specifically identified documents, including the February 1978 field reports from the restricted site northeast of Reliance, the logistics records showing the transport of sealed containers from that site, the medical monitoring records for personnel who visited the site, and the full text of the Soviet settlement agreement. The outcome of that appeal is uncertain. Previous appeals on subsets of these documents have been unsuccessful. The Federal Information Commissioner has, in past decisions, acknowledged that the public interest in transparency about historical incidents affecting Indigenous communities should be weighed against classification considerations, and has recommended more disclosure than the government has ultimately provided. Whether the Commissioner's recommendations will carry more weight in this instance than they have in previous ones is an open question. The community of Lutselke, located on the eastern arm of Great Slave Lake, has perhaps the most direct connection to the Cosmos 954 incident of any of the affected communities. The hunters from Lutselke, who found the first piece of debris, who handled it without protection, who brought it back toward their community before being intercepted by search teams, were the first civilians to have physical contact with radioactive material from the crash. Their experience and the health of their community in the years since is the most direct available test of what the contamination actually did to people. The community has commissioned its own oral history of the incident, collecting the memories of community members who were alive in 1978 and their families, preserving a record of the experience from the inside rather than from the perspective of the government that managed the response. That oral history, portions of which have been shared with researchers and journalists over the years, describes an experience that is quite different from the official account. Not more dramatic in the sense of invoking unusual phenomena, simply more human, more specific about what it felt like to encounter something dangerous without being told it was dangerous, to be interviewed by officials who spoke a different language and came and went without explanation, to spend months and years wondering whether what happened was related to the health problems that subsequently emerged in the community without ever being given a clear answer. The oral history also preserves accounts of what community members observed in the environment in the months after the crash: the discolored ice on certain lakes, the unusual animal deaths, the fish that tasted wrong. These observations, consistent across multiple community members and consistent with the physical predictions of what radioactive contamination would do to a subarctic freshwater ecosystem, have been largely absent from the official record and from the mainstream accounts of the incident. Making them part of the official record, taking them seriously as evidence, would require the kind of genuine collaboration between the Canadian government and the affected communities that has been called for repeatedly and has not been provided. It would require a formal, funded research program combining scientific environmental assessment with systematic collection of oral history and traditional ecological knowledge, a program in which the communities are partners rather than subjects, in which their knowledge is valued rather than dismissed, and in which the findings are incorporated into a comprehensive public account of what happened. Such a program has been proposed. It has not been funded. The government's position remains that the existing record is adequate and that there is no ongoing public health concern requiring further investigation. The community's position remains that this is wrong, that the existing record is incomplete, and that they are still living with consequences that the government has never adequately acknowledged. The story of what the Canadian government found frozen in the subarctic in January 1978 is at its core a story about the collision between the orderly world of official classifications and the disorderly reality of what happens when things go wrong in places where the government cannot fully control the narrative. The satellite came down. The contamination spread. The communities encountered it without warning. The search teams found things that did not fit the expected parameters. And the government, with the reflexes of an institution trained to manage risk through information control, classified what it could, disclosed what it had to, and hoped that the remoteness of the incident and the powerlessness of the communities most affected would allow the story to stay contained. It has not fully stayed contained. It has not been fully told. It exists 46 years later in the space between what the documents show and what the documents conceal, between the official account and the community memory, between what was found in the snow of the Northwest Territories and what was put in sealed containers and carried away on unmarked flights to places that are still not publicly identified. The thing that was found, whatever it fully was, is still a secret, but the secret has been leaking for decades, slowly and unevenly, through the fragments of declassified documents and the testimony of aging former personnel and the observations of independent researchers and the persistent advocacy of communities that refuse to accept that what happened to them does not deserve a full accounting. The leak will continue. The archives do not stay closed forever. The people who know talk eventually, to their children, to their grandchildren, to researchers who find them at the right moment. The environmental record, read carefully enough, tells its own version of the story. The documents, classified or not, cast shadows that can be traced even when the documents themselves are not available. What fell from the sky over Canada in January 1978 was a Soviet satellite carrying a nuclear reactor. What it left behind was more complicated than that. It left contamination in the snow and in the sediment and in the food chain of a landscape that had not been contaminated by anything so acute in living memory. It left a gap in the public record where information that the government chose to withhold should be. It left communities whose knowledge of their own experience has never been fully taken seriously. And it left a question, specific and documented and still unanswered, about what was at the site northeast of Reliance in February 1978, what required specialized containment protocols not applicable to standard debris recovery, and what was put in sealed containers and carried away on flights, whose manifests do not fully account for what they were carrying. That question has been asked for 46 years. The answer is still classified? It should not be. There are stories that governments prefer stay regional. The Cosmos 954 incident was one of them. The national and international press covered the basics in 1978, but the coverage was brief, the details were managed, and within months the story had effectively left the front pages and entered the category of resolved matters that no longer required sustained public attention. This is what successful information management looks like in practice. Not a dramatic suppression of the press, not a confrontation with journalists who are then silenced, simply a slow, careful management of what is released and when, a consistent messaging that the situation is under control and the public has been protected, and a reliance on the fact that without documents to work from, reporters cannot establish what they cannot see. The Canadian press in 1978 was not well equipped to challenge the government's narrative about a highly technical incident in a remote location. The reporters who covered the story were working without access to the classified documents, without the technical expertise to independently assess the radiological claims, and without sources inside the operation who were willing to speak on the record. The government provided briefings, released sanitized summaries, and gave access to officials who delivered the approved message with appropriate technical confidence. The press reported what it was given. This is not a criticism of the journalists who covered the story. It is a description of how classified incidents involving technical complexity and remote locations work. The information asymmetry between the government and the public is, in cases like this, nearly absolute. The government knows what happened. The public knows what the government chooses to tell it. And the machinery of classification, of confidentiality, agreements, of official spokespeople who have been authorized to say certain things and not others, ensures that the gap between those two bodies of knowledge can be sustained for a very long time. What breaks these situations open, eventually, is usually a combination of factors. Declassification through the passage of time. Individuals who were present choosing to speak when the constraints on their speech have loosened. Independent research that reconstructs the story from indirect evidence. Community advocacy that maintains pressure on the official record over years and decades, and sometimes access to information from the other side of a bilateral relationship, documents released by a foreign government that shed light on what the Canadian government has kept hidden. In the case of Cosmos 954, some Soviet and Russian archival material has become available since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, though access to sensitive Soviet-era records remains inconsistent and politically constrained. What has come out has tended to confirm the basic technical picture of the satellite and its reactor, while leaving the questions about the specific events at the restricted site in the Northwest Territories entirely unaddressed from the Soviet side. The Soviet records, to the extent they are available, address the satellite and the diplomatic negotiation. They do not address what Canadian search teams found on the ground. This is expected. The Soviet records would not have information about what was found at a specific location in the Canadian subarctic. Weeks after the crash, that information exists only on the Canadian side in the documents that remain classified and in the memories of the personnel who were there. The personnel, It is worth thinking about them specifically, as individuals rather than as categories. The soldiers who flew the survey missions and worked the ground teams, the scientists who analyzed the samples, the logistics personnel who organized the movement of equipment and materials across a landscape that punished any logistical failure with potentially lethal consequences, the officials who drafted the reports and made the decisions about what to include and what to withhold. These were people, most of them young people in 1978, who were doing their jobs in difficult circumstances and who were also, in many cases, participants in decisions that they may not have fully understood at the time. Some of them have carried the experience with them for 46 years. The ones who worked the restricted site, specifically, who observed whatever was there, who handled whatever was in those sealed containers, who understood that they were being asked to treat this location differently from everything else in the operation, and who may or may not have been told why. They know something the public does not know. Whether they will choose to say it, whether the confidentiality agreements they signed are still legally binding, whether the passage of time and the approach of the end of their own lives will change the calculus about what they are willing to share, these are questions without predetermined answers. History, in my experience of studying it, tends to come out, not completely, not cleanly, not on any particular schedule, but it comes out. The people who know things talk. The documents find their way into archives. The researchers who are paying attention find the threads and pull on them. The communities that were affected maintain the memory and the pressure. And eventually, enough pieces accumulate that the picture becomes visible, even if it remains incomplete. The picture that has accumulated around Cosmos 954 is already more complete than it was a decade ago, and more complete than it was 2 decades ago. Each round of access to information releases adds something. Each researcher who publishes findings from the partial record adds something. Each community member who shares their experience adds something. The picture is not complete, but it is substantially clearer than the official account, and it points clearly in the direction of a story that the Canadian government has not found it in its interest to fully tell. The 47th anniversary of the crash will come in January 2025. Whether it will be marked by any official acknowledgement, any new disclosure, any substantive response to the outstanding requests for accountability remains to be seen. The record of previous anniversaries does not provide grounds for optimism, but the record of the longer arc of this case, the slow, imperfect, incomplete process by which more has become known over time, does provide grounds for continued attention. The story of what fell from the sky over the Canadian Arctic in January 1978 is not finished. The classified documents are not all released. The environmental assessment is not complete. The community experience has not been fully recorded or fully taken seriously. And the question of what was at the restricted site, what required specialized containment protocols that standard radiological recovery did not, what was put in sealed containers and carried away on flights whose records do not fully account for their cargo, remains unanswered. It is a question worth keeping alive. The people who need it answered have been waiting long enough. The Arctic does not forget. This is something the Dean and the Inuit have always known, something that the geological record confirms, something that anyone who has spent serious time in the North comes to understand in a way that is more than intellectual. The cold preserves. What is put into the permafrost stays there. What enters the sediment of a subarctic lake does not simply disappear. The landscape holds what happens to it, and it holds it for a long time. In the summer months, when the subarctic briefly thaws, the lakes and rivers of the Northwest Territories come alive in ways that are startling to anyone who knows them only in their winter aspect. Waterfowl arrive in enormous numbers. Fish move through the river systems following patterns they have followed for thousands of years. Caribou migrate across the barrens in herds that can still, in some areas, reach numbers that seem impossible to someone accustomed to a more depleted world. The land, despite everything that has been done to it, retains a resilience that is one of the more quietly remarkable things in the natural world. But the land also carries what has been put into it, the DUW line contamination. The residues of atmospheric nuclear testing that settled into Arctic soils and sediments through the 1950s and 1960s and are still detectable in certain geological layers. And in one corridor, running roughly 800 kilometers from the Yukon Northwest Territories border to the west shore of Baker Lake, the debris of a Soviet satellite that carried a nuclear reactor and came apart in the atmosphere over northern Canada on the morning of January 24th, 1978. How much of that debris is still there? In what form? Doing what? To the environment and to the food chain is a question that has not been definitively answered. The monitoring that has been done is insufficient. The samples that have been taken are too sparse. The independent research that would provide a comprehensive picture has not been funded. The government that has the most relevant information about the original contamination distribution has kept that information in classified files. The communities that live in and around the affected area continue to hunt and fish and travel across the landscape, as they have always done. They do so with the knowledge, or the suspicion, that something happened to their territory nearly half a century ago that they were not fully told about, and whose effects have not been fully assessed. They carry this knowledge alongside everything else they carry, alongside the knowledge of the land and the seasons and the animals that has sustained their communities across generations, and they continue to press for the accounting that has been promised and not delivered. Accountability is not a comfortable thing for governments to provide when the accounting reveals significant failure. It is more comfortable to manage the story, to release information incrementally, to acknowledge what can no longer be denied, and withhold what can still be contained, to hope that the passage of time and the attrition of the people who remember will eventually allow the matter to be considered closed. The communities will not allow it to be considered closed. They have too much at stake, and they have been patient too long. The researchers and advocates who work alongside them will not allow it to be considered closed. And the accumulated documentary record, partial and imperfect as it is, will not allow it to be considered closed, because it points too clearly toward a story that is larger than what the official account contains. Something was found frozen in the Canadian Arctic in the winter of 1978. Something that required specialized containment. Something that was classified immediately and has remained classified for 46 years. Something that the people who were closest to it, the communities who lived in its vicinity, have been asking about ever since. The question is still open. The answer is still owed. It is past time to pay it,